There's a story of two fairly young children, a brother and a sister, that decide one day to set out on kind of an afternoon outing. And what they're going to do is climb up a small mountain near where they live. And as they're hiking up this mountain path, the sister, younger sister, looks at her brother and starts complaining. And she says, this isn't a path at all. This is just full of bumps and rocks, and it's hard, and it's difficult, and I'm tired, and I want to go home. And the brother stops and looks at his sister, and he looks at her and he says, these bumps, these rocks, are what you have to use to climb up the mountain. They don't get in the way, they're what you have to use. And the little story kind of highlights a very real reality for us as humans. Often when we face problems, we look at them in different ways. Two people facing the same set of circumstances, the same challenge, will sometimes view them in different ways. To one person, that circumstance or that challenge or that struggle may seem insurmountable and may actually be debilitating to the point where they just feel like they can't move forward at all. But to another person, they look at that same exact situation and they view it as a help in their journey in life. Now, if you're like me, most of us really fall in that category of looking at things as insurmountable, as difficult, as really challenging, rather than looking at them as a help as we travel through this journey called life. And if we think about some of the greatest names in the Bible, some of the biblical characters that we become familiar with as children in Sunday school and Bible school, and as we kind of dive into the Bible, some of those greatest names, their life represented that same exact thing. Consider for a moment Abraham. Abraham was asked to leave everything, to leave his homeland, to leave his farm, to get rid of everything and move. God directed him to move. So he did that. And then shortly thereafter, he was faced with several years of famine. But he went through that. And then he and his family dealt with wars, attacks from people outside their own property, their own community. And then he had, the very real struggle that people experience today of not having any children, not being able to have children, and going through life with that desire unfulfilled. And then, when he gets to a ripe old age and kind of comes to terms with the fact that he's not going to have kids, he has a child. Most of us wouldn't want to have children as we're becoming centenarians. Around the ripe old age of 100 isn't the time that we want to start thinking about having kids. And then he's asked to sacrifice that child. He's asked to take his son, his only son born of him and his wife, and sacrifice that child. So Abraham certainly faced a great deal of difficulty and struggle in his life journey. But we can think about Joseph of the Old Testament. Joseph was picked on by his brothers, really tormented by his brothers. To use a modern term, I guess we could say he was bullied. He was sold into slavery. He was falsely accused of rape, put back into prison for that, and through all that, he glorified God. Through all that got him to the end point of serving the way that God needed him to serve and leading a group of people, a nation, through a difficult time. And the list kind of goes on and on. If we look at David certainly had his struggles and challenges in life, but yet lived for God's glory. Daniel was the same way. Paul was the same way. So today we kind of have to think about how about us? How about you? Is life rough? Have you experienced times where life is difficult, life presents its struggles? As we started last week looking in the book of Revelation, where Jesus gives John the very clear message to 7 specific churches, we pick up today with the second of the 7 churches, the church in Smyrna. In this passage of Scripture, really directly addresses how we respond to and how we view the struggles and challenges that we experience in life. There's some really valuable teaching in here for us that's relevant as we walk through a life that can certainly be difficult and can certainly be challenging. So we'll look at Revelations chapter 2, verses 8 through 11. Verses 8 through 11. It says, "To the angel of the church in Smyrna write, These are the words of him who is the first and the last, who died and came to life again. I know your afflictions and your poverty, yet you are rich. I know the slander of those who say they are Jews and are not, but are a synagogue of Satan. Do not be afraid of what you are about to suffer. I tell you, the devil will put some of you in prison to test you, and you will suffer persecution for 10 days. Be faithful, even to the point of death, and I will give you the crown of life. He who has an ear, let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches. He who overcomes will not be hurt at all by the second death." So to give you a little bit of background on the church in Smyrna, last week we talked about the church in Ephesus, and Ephesus being a large port city at the time. Smyrna is actually about 35 miles to the north of Ephesus, and it also is a port city, but a little bit differently. It's not right on the sea coast, but rather it is kind of at the end of a bay off of the sea there. And Smyrna is a very old city. Even at this time, even in 95 AD, when Revelation was written, when it was recorded, Smyrna was a very old city. In fact, Smyrna's been around since roughly about 1000 BC. And it was an important city throughout history until it was about 350 BC. It was destroyed in a military conquest, another shift in the ruling government of the area. And then in about 200 BC, Alexander the Great, if we reach back in our minds to history class, we remember Alexander the Great. He ordered the city to be rebuilt just a couple miles from where it originally was. And as it was rebuilt, it was built on a mountainside with the river on one side of it, an important land trade route going out of the city, and again on the other side of the mountain being located right on the bay. So being such a trade center, Smyrna was a wealthy city. It was very, very well off. It had a lot of people passing through, and it was also a well-known city at the time. In fact, anybody here ever heard of Homer, the author, the writer Homer? He wrote the Iliad, and he was actually from Smyrna, and he wrote the Iliad when he lived in Smyrna. So that kind of gives us a little bit of a background there. And interestingly, even though Jesus addressed this letter, this message to the church in Smyrna, this is the only place that the church in Smyrna is mentioned in the Bible. It's not mentioned elsewhere. We hear nothing of how it started, how it began. We just have this brief snapshot. Smyrna was also a city that was completely devoted to Rome and the Roman Empire. It was the first city to have a statue, a physical statue of the Roman goddess Roma. It was the first one to have a statue of that. And being that it was so, we'll say, behind and in line with the Roman government, Christianity was illegal in Smyrna. It was illegal to be practiced. It was illegal to be a practicing Christian in Smyrna. But yet at the same time, the Jewish faith thrived there. There were many Jewish settlers in Smyrna, and the Jewish church was very strong and very influential in that area. So as we look at Jesus' message and keeping in mind that this is an environment where it would be difficult to be a practicing Christian, an environment where it would be difficult to certainly get together as a church, We need to keep that in mind as we take a look at Jesus' word, at Jesus' message here. And he says to the church, I know your afflictions and your poverty. I know your afflictions and your poverty. Interestingly, the original language here, when it talks about afflictions, it talks about the type of struggle, the type of difficulty that is described as being like you're under a crushing weight. Has anybody here ever experienced circumstances in life where it just felt like it was crushing you, that all of life was falling in around you? Has anybody here ever experienced that? Yeah, there's a few heads nodding, hands up. I think many of us can relate to that. And so Jesus is looking at this church that has never been addressed before biblically and saying, hey, I know what you're experiencing. I know what you are experiencing that is weighing you down, that is burdening you. And he also says, I know your poverty. Now, again, when we look at the the original language that gets translated into the word poverty, there was biblically two different words that were used related to poverty. One was having just what you need, but not enough for extras. So we would look at that in our society as having a dry, warm place to live, and having enough food to eat, but probably not enough for a new pair of jeans, or probably not enough for an ice cream cone or lunch at McDonald's. And then there's the other term, poverty, which is what's being used here, where you have nothing. You don't know where your next meal is going to come from. You don't know where you may lay your head down at night. See, to live the Christian life in Smyrna at this point in time was to be so different from everybody else in the city that you really weren't a part of the marketplace. You couldn't get a job. It was very hard to buy, sell, trade, to participate in any sort of transactions whatsoever. So if you can imagine having absolutely no income, no means to get income, no means that if you had income to spend your money to get anything, that's kind of what we're talking about here. That's kind of what the church in Smyrna experienced in how they lived their life. So now that we kind of understand the nature of the situation, we have to look at what Jesus is saying. Jesus is looking at them and saying, I know you're suffering. He's saying, I'm aware of what you're experiencing. I'm aware of what you're going through. And we look at that and we ask, well, how? How would he know? The obvious answer is, well, as God, as being an all-knowing God, he knows everything that we experience. He knows everything that happens to us. But also we have to look at his own suffering, Jesus' own suffering. Think about times when you've been in the midst of difficulty, a struggle, a loss, a real challenge. And somebody comes up beside you and says, well, I know how you're feeling. Sometimes we sense that that's true. They do know how we're feeling. Other times we think, really? How do you know what I'm feeling? How do you know how I'm feeling? When we go through struggle, when we go through difficulty, we rely most on and we gain the most comfort from those who have experienced the struggle that we have, that have walked down the same path that we're on, that have stood right where we're at and come out on the other side. And in Jesus, we find that sort of comfort. You know, we think about the life of Jesus. He entered this world poor. He grew up poor. He was raised the son of a carpenter, which, by the way, you know, Joseph's carpentry business, where he was located, we now understand at the time that he would have had to literally hike for miles to haul wood back to build anything out of. Wood was very scarce where he was at. So he grew up in very poor, hard-working conditions. Pretty clearly, Jesus was different. He was weird, strange. And he really, you could almost say, he lived his life as a beggar, right? He never owned a home. As an adult, never really called any one place home. Never went to the grocery store or anything like that. Just relied on God the Father to provide for him as he went along. Just relied on his needs, or waited on his needs to be met. So Jesus really can understand what these people in Smyrna were going through. He can understand that crushing pressure of life coming in. You know, we think about the words that he shared and what he experienced on the night before his death, his earthly death. You know, certainly none of us have been there ourselves, but we think of what that must be like. So he can certainly understand a crushing type pressure. He can certainly understand the struggles, the afflictions that the church in Smyrna was going through. And he certainly understands poverty. And yet he's quick to point out to them, in spite of that, in spite of your earthly struggles, in spite of your earthly poverty, you are rich. So he's encouraging them to think not from an earthly perspective, but a heavenly perspective. And we look at what he says in verse 10 as he addresses this. I know your afflictions and your poverty. I know your afflictions and your poverty. But he says, don't be afraid. Be not afraid. Don't worry about this. And it's important to note that he didn't say he would take away suffering. He didn't say that he would give them a break from that pressure. He didn't say he would make the road easy. He didn't promise them an easy life at all. In fact, he promised just the opposite of that. In fact, he lets them know that there's greater suffering to come, more suffering to come. Which brings us into the very, very real question that probably all of us have struggled with and had to face and had to try to answer for ourselves as well as others. Why? Why do we have to suffer? Why does God allow suffering? And while there's not an easy answer to that, we have to recognize two very real things. Number one, God's not the cause of our suffering. We live in a world that while God is supreme, this world is Satan's realm at present time. God's not the cause of our suffering. Could he stop it? Yeah, he could. But then our faith and our obedience would mean nothing. God's not the cause of the suffering. And the other reason why is we need to look at the faith that comes through suffering for his glory. Think about this for a moment. If you never experience pain, would you know Jesus as a healer? If you never experience difficulties, would you know Jesus as a deliverer? If you never had a trial or a struggle in your life, would you be an overcomer? If you never felt sadness, would you know Jesus as a comforter? If you never did something wrong, would you have experienced Jesus' forgiveness? If you never had troubles in life, would you know Jesus as a rescuer? If you were never broken, would you know that Jesus makes you whole? It's almost as if Jesus is saying to the church in Smyrna, to us, if I gave you all things, how would you appreciate them? If you had everything, how would you appreciate it? It's almost like Jesus is saying, if I never corrected you, how would you know that I love you? It's almost like he's saying, if you had all power, how would you learn to depend on me? Which really leads to, if your life was perfect, what would you need me for? If our life was perfect, what would we need Jesus for? We wouldn't. We wouldn't. So the struggles that we have in life really are there, yes, out of circumstances that we can't control and God chooses not to. But the struggles are there and they grow our faith. as we walk through them, as we experience them. Just like the two kids in the story that I shared at the beginning, as they're climbing the mountain. You know, one looked at them as obstacles, and then her brother looked at him as a way to help get up the mountain. In our journey of life, as we experience struggles, we can look at them as a way to grow in our faith, a way to know God better, and a way to rely on Jesus more. And Jesus also points out in this message, he says, I know the slander of those who say they are Jews and are not, but rather are a synagogue of Satan. As a church, do we experience slander today? As Christians in American society, do we experience slander today? This is probably easier for us to relate to than that kind of crushing oppression and persecution and poverty that was thrust upon Christian believers. Because we look at this, and as a church today, if we take a biblical stand on any of the societal issues in our country, what happens? We're intolerant, we're unloving, we're hate-filled people. That's the reaction that we see. That's the reaction that we hear. In fact, I think I've shared before, we don't have TV in our house, so I read the news on the internet. And the unique thing, I don't know if it's good or bad, but the unique thing about it is below each article, people have the opportunity to comment, to share their thoughts. And so you kind of get a snapshot of what some portion of the public thinks about that particular news item. And it frequently results in, some entertaining or interesting debate. And what you'll see is exactly what I'm talking about. You'll see if somebody takes a Christian stand on an issue like abortion or marriage or any of the other number of other issues that our country faces, prayer in school, say, any of those things, you will see the response to that biblical stand being so strong, not against our God directly, but rather just calling out how hate-filled it is and how intolerant it is and so on and so forth, And that's the kind of slander that we experience as the church today. That's almost the kind of slander that they were experiencing in Smyrna. We have the Jews who serve God and the Christians who serve God, just in somewhat different ways. But these Jews were speaking out so harshly against the church, and Jesus calls them out on it. And he tells them, he says, hey, they're from the synagogue of Satan. They're not following me. So Jesus is encouraging this church in Smyrna to continue in their practice of biblical teaching and living that out. And he goes on with his encouragement to not be afraid about what they're about to suffer, and provides them with a perspective. He says, this suffering may get worse, but know that you will suffer persecution, it says for 10 days. And we don't know if that's exactly 10 calendar days. But what we do know is when we look at, in the context of life, 10 days is pretty short. So what we can take away from this is we know that our struggles, our suffering, that we may experience, the difficult times in life, in the grand scheme of things, in the grand idea of eternity, even if we experience our entire life as being one big trial after another, after another, after another, in the context of eternity, it's short. It's short. This is just for a time. So Jesus promises them, gives them the word that this is just for a time. But continue being faithful, even if it means death. Continue being faithful. And he offers them the reward of the crown of life. He lets them know that really what it comes down to is whether life is grand or whether life is terrible. Living a godly life is the same, right? You live a life in submission to God. You glorify Him in everything you do. And you praise Him for the circumstances that you have. If it's great, that's what you do. If it's terrible, that's what you do. It's the same thing. So Jesus is saying, think eternally, and you will receive the crown of life. So what about Smyrna today? Today, Smyrna is a town, a city called Izmir, Turkey. Izmir, Turkey. It's over 99% Islamic. It's about 0.2% Christian. The Turkish government is much more liberal in the sense that they don't necessarily stop the Christians from practicing their faith and having church. But persecution is still very real there. In the midst of that, the church in Smyrna, as it exists today, the church in Izmir, Turkey, they still remain steadfast in their faith. So what about Melita today? What about us? What about you individually? Whatever struggle we're facing together, whatever struggle you're facing individually, whatever pressure we're on, the choice is really ours. Are we going to crumble, or are we going to be like the Smyrnians, the church in Smyrna? Will we trust in the one who suffered for us, and through that give glory to God? That's our choice.